10 Story Tips for Game Designers. Story tip number 1. Respect the story stack. When developing a game that you hope has a compelling story, it can be very tempting to begin not by designing a game, but by designing your story, or writing your story. There is something enticingly concrete about plotting out a story, with engaging characters and exciting events, something that draws in novice game designers who find it easier to sketch out a story idea than to deal with complexities of game mechanics and psychology. But this path is fraught with terrible peril, and has ruined more games than any other mistake that I know of. I learned about the story stack from designer Jason Vandenberg, who needed to explain it to me because I had fallen into its terrible trap, wasting time, resources, and almost destroying a game I cared about very much. It is because of this intense danger that I make this story tip number 1. Figure 17.4 shows the story stack in all its glory. It is not a complicated idea, simply a list of 5 important elements that comprise story games. But these elements are sorted in an important way, from least flexible, fantasy at the bottom, to most flexible, story at the top. Let us consider each one of these elements and how they relate to one another, in order starting at the wisest place. Fantasy. It sounds crazy to say that of these 5 elements, fantasy is the least flexible. After all, isn't fantasy more flexible than anything? I can fantasize about anything I want, and while that is true, there is something terrifyingly inflexible about fantasies. Either a fantasy appeals to a player, or it does not. There's no middle ground. A story game about a flying superhero makes sense. Many people have that fantasy. But a story game about being a professional dishwasher? I'll have a much harder time keeping people interested, because that just isn't a fantasy that most people have. It's important to begin your design with a strong fantasy. After all, one of the main reasons that people play games is fantasy fulfillment. If your fantasy fails to resonate with your players, everything else you do will be an uphill battle. A clear statement of the central fantasy of your game is a rock upon which you can build something powerful. Action. Once you have your fantasy clearly articulated, you next want to think about what player actions are best suited to fulfilling that fantasy. In the development of Pixie Hollow Online, which was based in part on the Disney Tinker Bell movie, we had an initial design where players engaged in many of the actions from the movie. They could help animals, harvest items from nature, make gifts for other fairies, help famous fairies solve interpersonal problems, and many other things. We proudly brought this design to a focus group of young girls to gauge their interest. To our embarrassment, they said, "These things seem interesting, but what I really want to do is fly." We had overlooked flying as an important action because it was of minimal importance in the movie script. It was just a way of transitioning from one activity to another. And so, in our design, flying only happened in cutscenes. But when we took a step back, it became obvious that to fulfill the fantasy of being a fairy like Tinkerbell, the primary game action should be flying. Thankfully, the girls set us straight while we still had time to make the change. In the final version of the game, players would fly constantly during all of their activities, and we gave special attention to the feel of the flight so that it would fulfill the fantasy in a delightful way. Economy. Now that you have a set of actions that solidly fulfill an appealing fantasy, now you need a system of progress that will reward those actions, especially those actions that best fulfill the fantasy. As we discussed in Chapter 13, Balance, game economies are defined by earning and spending. The simplest game economies are really just about earning points, earning access to the next level, earning a win. It is easy to reward the wrong things in your game. For example, maybe you create a game centered on the fantasy of being a ninja. You choose actions like throwing ninja stars, sneaking up on enemies, and striking enemies with a ninja sword, which help fulfill that fantasy. However, if you accidentally design levels where, in order to win, players must tediously memorize the locations of hidden traps, you are rewarding actions that work against the fantasy of being a ninja. In the Pixie Hollow Online example, we wanted players to earn progress from many different tasks and be able to use the earnings to get new outfits to play dress up with their fairy. But should fairies have money? Fairy bucks felt like they went directly against the fantasy of being a fairy. Something like a barter system felt like it would fit the fairy fantasy much better, and we implemented just that, a system of many currencies. A given fairy shop might offer a pair of slippers for 5 pine needles, a hair ribbon for 2 blueberries, and a dress for 6 lily petals. This created an economy that matched the fantasy of being a fairy, and encouraged the actions we wanted. Players desiring these items would fly off on a scavenger hunt to find out where in Pixie Hollow they could earn what they needed. World. Once you have your fantasy, your actions, and your economy in place, now you need a world where they make sense. We will talk more about this soon in Chapter 19, Worlds, but in short, you need to create a place with rules where the economy you have created makes sense. If you've made a game all about running and jumping, collecting stars that the player trades in for magical items, you should have some explanation of where these stars came from and why the sellers of the magical items want the stars. And where did the magical items come from anyway? This set of rules about how your world works is not yet story. Story is a series of events. A world is a place that operates by certain rules. If the rules of your world do not match the rules of your economy, everything about your game will feel hollow and fake. Story. And at last, here we are at the top of the stack. Now that we have a solid fantasy, actions that fulfill it, an economy that rewards those actions, and a world that justifies that economy, we are at last ready to develop our story. It should be a story that makes the world we've created make sense, and a story where the player actions and progress are important. As we'll see in the next tip, story has an almost infinite flexibility to make even the strangest situations seem understandable and normal. Despite this flexibility, story still always wants to take over the story stack. When story gets in its way, it will enslave the entire process of game design. Story should not be the master of the game, but rather a willing servant, using its flexibility to create the greatest game experience possible. If ever you find yourself, or someone on your team, saying, "We can't do that, it goes against the story," is a clear signal that story has tricked you, trapped you, and taken over your game. And this is why it is so important to respect the story stack. Wherever you begin with your design, you place a stake in the ground. Placing a story stake in the ground is foolish, because now, somehow, you will have to drag inflexible fantasy to where that stake has been placed. On the other hand, if you find a powerful but inflexible fantasy and put your stake there, then when you have built up the other elements, you can easily craft a story that explains why your stake is exactly where it is. And that leads us to story tip number 2. Story tip number 2, put your story to work. As we discussed in Chapter 5, Elements, it is possible to start design in any corner of the tetrad, story, gameplay, technology, or aesthetics. And many designs begin with a story. Following that story too slavishly at the expense of the other elements is a common mistake, and an especially silly one, since story is, in some ways, the most pliable of all the elements. Story elements can often be changed with just a few words, where changing elements of gameplay might take weeks of balancing, and changing elements of technology might take months of reprogramming. I once heard some developers of a 3DO game talk about some development headaches they were having. Their game involved flying over a planet in a spaceship and shooting down enemy ships. The game was 3D, and to maintain performance, they could not afford to draw distinct terrain. To keep the terrain from looking strange when it popped in, they had planned to use the old trick of making the world foggy. But due to some quirk of the 3D hardware, the only fog they could make was a weird green color that looked completely unrealistic. Initially, the team assumed they would have to scrap this solution, when suddenly, story to the rescue. Someone had the idea that maybe the evil aliens who had taken over the planet had done so by shrouding it with toxic gas. This little change in the story suddenly made a technical approach that supported the desired gameplay mechanic completely possible. As a side effect, it arguably improved the story, making the alien takeover seem all the more dramatic. I had a similar experience developing my Mordak's Revenge board game. My initial design for the gameplay required players to travel about the board, collecting 5 keys. When they had all 5, they had to journey to the stronghold of the evil wizard Mordak to unlock the stronghold and battle him. In playtests, it quickly became clear that it would be a better game mechanic if Mordak could somehow come to the player who had collected the keys, since it was more immediate, and it meant that the battle against Mordak could be fought in a variety of terrains. But I was troubled because then the story didn't make any sense. So, once again, the story to the rescue. What if instead, Mordek had a secret stronghold that no one could find? Instead of collecting the keys, the players had to collect 5 summoning stones. And when all 5 were collected, Mordek could be summoned immediately out of his stronghold and forced to battle the player in whatever terrain the player was currently in. This simple change to the story made the desired gameplay possible. It also was more novel than my somewhat trite villain in the castle story. Always keep in mind how limber, flexible, and powerful a story can be. Don't be afraid to mold your story to support the gameplay you think is best. Story tip number 3. Goals, obstacles, and conflicts. It is an old maxim of Hollywood screenwriting that the main ingredients for a story are 1. A character with a goal, and 2. Obstacles that keep him or her from reaching that goal. As the character tries to overcome the obstacles, interesting conflicts tend to arise, particularly when another character has a conflicting goal. This simple pattern leads to very interesting stories because it means the character has to engage in problem solving, which we find very interesting. Because conflicts lead to unpredictable results, in other words, surprises, which we find very interesting, and because the bigger the obstacle, the bigger the potential for dramatic change, which we find very interesting. Are these ingredients just as useful when creating video game stories? Absolutely, and maybe even more so. We've already discussed lens number 32, goals. The goal of the main character will be the goal of the player and will be the driving force that keeps them moving along the string of pearls, if you choose to create one. And the obstacles that a character meets will be the challenges the player faces. If you want your game to have a solidly integrated story, it is very important that these things line up. If you give the player a challenge that has nothing to do with the obstacles the main character faces, you have just weakened the experience considerably. But if you can find a way to make the challenges of the game meaningful, as well as dramatic obstacles for the main character, your story and game structure will fuse into one, which goes a long way toward making the player feel like part of the story. We already have a lens of goals. Here is its sister lens. Number 74, the lens of the obstacle. A goal with no obstacles is not worth pursuing. Use this lens to make sure your obstacles are ones that your players will want to overcome. What is the relationship between the main character and the goal? Why does the character care about it? What are the obstacles between the character and the goal? Is there an antagonist who is behind the obstacles? What is the relationship between the protagonist and the antagonist? Do the obstacles gradually increase in difficulty? Some say the bigger the obstacle, the better the story. Are your obstacles big enough, or can they be bigger? Great stories often involve the protagonist transforming in order to overcome the obstacle. How does your protagonist transform? Story tip number 4. Make it real. Know your world as God knows this one. Robert McKee. It's one thing to come up with a plotline, a list of characters, and a set of rules for a fantasy world. It's something else, again, to see it in your mind, as if it is a real place. To get there, you must think about it constantly, imagining you are one of the characters living in the world. One of the secrets of the ride design at Disney is that each experience, such as the Haunted Mansion or Splash Mountain, has an elaborate backstory that is not shared with the public, but all the designers know it and they use it to keep the world solid. Tolkien did not simply sit down and write The Lord of the Rings in one day. Instead, he spent years imagining and documenting the world of Middle-earth, its history, people, and languages, before the stories really began to take shape. That level of detailed planning is seldom necessary, but if you can't answer basic questions about the history of your world and the motivations of your characters, it will show in your work, and people will see it for what it is, unimaginative. Always remember, if it's not real to you, it's not real to them. Story tip number 5. Provide simplicity and transcendence. One thing that game worlds and fantasy worlds tend to have in common is that they offer the player a combination of simplicity, the game world is simpler than the real world, and transcendence, the player is more powerful in the game world than they are in the real world. This potent combination explains why so many types of story worlds show up again and again in games, such as the following. Medieval, The stream of swords and sorcery worlds seems to be never-ending. These worlds are simpler than the world we know because the technologies are primitive, but they are seldom accurate simulations of medieval times. There's always some kind of magic added, and this provides the transcendence. The continued success of this genre surely stems from the fact that it combines the simple and the transcendent in such a primal way. Futuristic. Many games and science fiction stories are set in the future, but these very seldom are any kind of realistic interpretation of the future we are likely to see. One with continued suburban sprawl, safer cars, longer work hours, and ever more complicated cell phone plans. No, the future that we see in these worlds is usually more of a post-apocalyptic future. In other words, a bomb went off, or we are on some strange frontier planet, and the world is much simpler. And of course, we have access to sufficiently advanced technologies, which, as Arthur C. Clarke noted, are indistinguishable from magic, at least in terms of transcendence. War. In war, things are simpler since all normal rules and laws are set aside, and the transcendence comes from a powerful weaponry that lets participants become like gods, deciding who lives and who dies. It is a horror in reality, but in fantasy it gives a player powerful feelings of simplicity and transcendence. Modern. Modern settings are unusual for game stories unless the player suddenly has surprisingly more power than normal. This can be accomplished in many ways. The Grand Theft Auto series uses criminal life to give both simplicity, life is simpler when you don't obey the laws, and transcendence, you are more powerful when you don't obey the laws. The Sims creates a simplified dollhouse version of human life, and it gives the player transcendent godlike powers to control the characters in the game. Finally, abstract. Abstract worlds, such as Minecraft, are not only simpler than the real world, they are simpler than the average video game. As Notch discovered, combining that simplicity with the godlike power to create and destroy can create a pretty successful game. Simplicity and transcendence form a powerful combination that is easily botched. Use this lens to make sure you combine them just right. Lens number 75, the lens of simplicity and transcendence. To make sure you have the right mix of simplicity and transcendence, ask yourself these questions. How is my world simpler than the real world? And can it be simpler in other ways? What kind of transcendent power do I give to the player? How can I give even more without removing challenge from the game? Is my combination of simplicity and transcendence contrived, or does it provide my players with a special kind of wish fulfillment? Story tip number 6. Consider the hero's journey. In 1949, mythologist Joseph Campbell published his first book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. In this text, he describes an underlying structure that most mythological stories seem to share, which he calls the monomyth, or hero's journey. He goes into great detail about how this structure underlies the stories of Moses, Buddha, Christ, Odysseus, Prometheus, Osiris, and many others. Many writers and artists found great inspiration in Campbell's work. Most famously, George Lucas based the structure of Star Wars around structures Campbell described with great success. In 1992, Christopher Vogler, a Hollywood writer and producer, published a book called The Writer's Journey, which is a practical guide to writing stories using the archetypes that Campbell describes. Vogler's book is not as scholarly as Campbell's text, but it serves as a far more accessible and practical guide for writers who would like to use the hero's journey as a framework. The Wachowskis, who wrote The Matrix, which rather clearly follows the hero's journey model, are said to have used Vogler's book as a guide. As accessible as the text is, it is often criticized for being over-formulaic and for shoehorning too many stories into a single formula. Nonetheless, many people find it gives them useful insights into the story and the structure of heroic stories. Because so many video games revolve around the theme of heroism, it is only logical that the hero's journey is a relevant structure for a powerful video game story. Since several books and a plethora of websites already exist describing how to structure a story around the hero's journey, I will only give an overview of it here. Vogler's synopsis of the hero's journey. 1. The ordinary world. Establishing scenes that show Our hero is a regular person leading an ordinary life. 2. The call to adventure. The hero is presented with a challenge that disrupts their ordinary life. 3. Refusal of the call. The hero makes excuses about why they can't go on the adventure. 4. Meeting with the mentor. Some wise figure gives advice, training, or aid. 5. Crossing the threshold. The hero leaves the ordinary world, often under pressure, and enters the adventure world. 6. Tests, allies, enemies. The hero faces minor challenges, makes allies, confronts enemies, and learns the workings of the adventure world. 7. Approaching the cave. The hero encounters setbacks and needs to try something new. 8. The ordeal. The hero faces a peak life or death crisis. 9. The reward. The hero survives, overcomes their fear, and gets the reward. 10. The road back. The hero returns to the ordinary world, but the problems still aren't all solved. 11. Resurrection. The hero faces a still greater crisis and has to use everything they have learned. And finally, 12. Return with the elixir. The journey is now well and truly complete, and the hero's success has improved the lives of everyone in the ordinary world. By no means do you have to have all 12 of these steps in your heroic story. You can tell a good story. By no means do you need to have all 12 of these steps in your heroic story. You can tell a good heroic story with fewer or more in a different order. As a side note, it is an interesting exercise to look at the hero's journey through lens number 69, the interest curve, and you will see a familiar form emerge. Some storytellers take great offense at the idea that good storytelling can be accomplished by formula. But the hero's journey is not so much a formula, guaranteed to produce an entertaining story. Rather, it is a form that many entertaining stories tend to take. Think of it as a skeleton. Just as humans have tremendous variety, despite all of us having the same 208 bones, heroic stories can take millions of forms despite some common internal structure. Most storytellers seem to agree that using the hero's journey as a starting point for your writing isn't a very good idea. As Bob Bates puts it, the hero's journey isn't a box of tools you can use to fix every story problem, but it's somewhat similar to a circuit tester. You can clamp the leads around a problem spot in your story and check to see if there's enough mythical currents flowing. And if you don't have enough juice, it can help point out the source of the problem. It's better to write your story first, and if you notice that it might have something in common with the elements of the monomyth, then spend some time considering whether your story might be improved by following archetypical structures and elements more closely. In other words, use the hero's journey as a lens. Number 76, the lens of the hero's journey. Many heroic stories have similar structure. Use this lens to make sure you haven't missed out on any elements that might improve your story. Ask yourself these questions. Does my story have elements that qualify it as a heroic story? If so, how does it match up with the structure of the hero's journey? Would my story be improved by including more archetypical elements? Does my story match this form so closely that it feels hackneyed? Story tip number 7. Keep your story world consistent. There's an old French saying that goes, if you add a spoonful of wine to a barrelful of sewage, you get a barrelful of sewage. If you add a spoonful of sewage to a barrelful of wine, you get a barrelful of sewage. In some ways, story worlds are fragile like the barrelful of wine. One small inconsistency in the logic of the world, and the reality of the world is broken forever. In Hollywood, the term jumping the shark is used to describe a television show that has deteriorated to a point that can never be taken seriously again. The term is referenced to the popular 70s show Happy Days. As a season finale, the writers had Fonzie, the most popular character in the show, jump over a line of school buses on his motorcycle. The episode was greatly hyped and had excellent ratings. In the next season, in an attempt to repeat the success and to play off the popularity of the film Jaws, they had a water-skiing Fonzie jump over a shark. This was so ridiculous and so far out of Fonzie's character that fans of the show were repulsed. The problem was not so much that one particular episode had a ridiculous premise, but rather that the character and his world were forever tainted and could never be seriously taken again. Here's another example. Shortly after the release of Mass Effect 3, many players complained at their disappointment with the ending to the trilogy. The creators responded, announcing they were going to release a patch that changed the ending. This led to a massive uproar, proving that the quality of a story is less important than the illusion that it is real. One small error and inconsistency can make a whole world break apart, damaging its past, present, and future. If you have a set of rules that defines how things work in your world, stick to them and take them seriously. If, for example, in your world you can pick up a microwave oven and put it in your pocket, that might be a little strange, but maybe in your world pockets are magic and can hold all kinds of things. If later, though, a player tries to put an ironing board in their pocket and is told that it's too big for you to carry, the player will be frustrated, will stop taking your story world seriously, and will stop projecting their imagination into it. Invisibly, in the blink of an eye, your world will have changed from a real, live place to a sad, broken toy. Story tip number 8. Make your story world accessible. In Jules Verne's classic tale From the Earth to the Moon, 1865, he tells the story of 3 men who travel to the moon in a spaceship fired from a giant cannon. Despite the fact that the book goes into great detail about the science of the cannon, the premise seems ridiculous to modern eyes because any cannon blast powerful enough to launch a spacecraft would surely kill anyone inside. We know from experience that rockets are a far safer and realistic method of sending people to the moon. One might think that Verne did not use rockets in his story because they had not yet been invented, but this was not the case. Rockets were commonly used as weapons at the time. Consider Rocket's red glare in the Star-Spangled Banner, which was written in 1814, for instance. So surely Verne knew about rockets, and he seems to have had enough of a scientific mind to realize that they were a much more reasonable method of putting craft into space than a cannon would be. So why did he write this story his way? The answer seems to be that it was much more accessible to his audience. Consider the progressions of military technology over the course of the 19th century. First, consider rockets. 1812, William Congreve's rockets, which are 6.5 inches in diameter, 42 pounds, 2-mile range. And in 1840, William Hale's rockets, which is the same as the Congreve's, but slightly more accurate. In nearly 30 years, rockets showed no growth and only slight improvement, but now consider cannons. In 1855, Dahlgren's gun, which is a 100-pound shell and had a 3-mile range, but in 1860, Rodman's Columbiad had a 1,000-pound shell and a 6-mile range. In a mere 5 years, the size of a cannon shell had increased by 10 times. Keeping in mind that the American Civil War was making international headlines in 1865, it only took a small leap of the imagination to picture even larger and more powerful cannons appearing within the next few years, possibly large enough to fire shells clear to the moon. Verne surely understood that rockets were the most likely method of man reaching the moon, but he was a storyteller, not a scientist, and he had the good sense to know that when you're telling a story, facts aren't always your friends. What the player will believe and enjoy is more important than what is physically accurate. When I worked on Pirates of the Caribbean: Battle for the Buccaneer Gold, several examples of this principle arose. One was the speed of the boat. Initially, we took pains to make sure our pirate ship traveled at a realistic speed, but we quickly found out that this speed was so slow, or appeared to be at our height from the water, that players quickly became bored. So we cast reality to the winds, as it were, and just made the boat go at a speed that felt realistic and exciting, even though it was not realistic at all. Another example can be clearly seen in the screenshot from the game. Look at those boats and consider which way the wind is howling. Weirdly, it seems to be behind all of them, and it indeed is. To ask players to understand how to sail a ship with the wind was simply too much to ask in an action game, and no player ever asked us about that. They simply assumed that the boats drove like cars or motorboats, because that is what they were familiar with. As a minor detail, consider the flags at the top of the ship masts. They are being blown in the opposite direction as the sails. The modeler of the ships initially had them facing the correct way, but It looked strange to our playtesters, who were more used to seeing a flag flying on a car antenna than on a ship's mast. Our players would frequently ask why the flags pointed the wrong way, and we would explain, "No, see, the wind is blowing from behind the ships." And they would say, "Oh, I guess that's right." But after a while, we got tired of explaining it, so we just made the flags point the other way, and people stopped asking about them because now they looked normal. There are times, though, that your story requires something strange that the player has never seen before, which can't be made readily accessible. In these cases, it is very important that you call special attention to that thing and make the players understand what it is and how it works. I once had a team of students who made a little game about two hamsters in a pet store who fall in love but are unable to meet because they are set in separate cages. Their game had the player use a little hamster cannon to try to launch the boy hamster to the girl hamster's cage. It was pointed out to them that there's no such thing as a hamster cannon, and as a result, the story seemed kind of strange and hard to believe. One solution would have been to change the cannon to something else that could launch the boy hamster, like perhaps a hamster wheel, but the team wanted to keep the cannon, so they took a different approach. In establishing shots of the pet shop, they prominently featured signs reading, "Special, hamster cannons on sale." This not only served as an intriguing hook for the experience, creating anticipation to see what a hamster cannon would look like, but it introduced this very strange item to the player so that when it showed up, it didn't seem so strange at all. Just a natural part of an unusual world. Surreal elements are not at all uncommon in games, and it is important that you understand how to smoothly integrate them. One handy way to do that is to use this lens. Lens number 77, the lens of the weirdest thing. Having weird things in your story can help give meaning to unusual game mechanics. It can capture the interest of the player, and it can make your world seem special. Too many things that are too weird, though, will render your story puzzling and inaccessible. To make sure your story is the good kind of weird, ask yourself these questions. What's the weirdest thing in my story? How can I make sure that the weirdest thing doesn't confuse or alienate the player? If there are multiple weird things, should I maybe get rid of or coalesce some of them? If there's nothing weird in my story, is the story still interesting? Story tip number 9. Use cliches judiciously. One criticism video game stories seem unable to escape is overuse of cliches, or tropes. After all, you can only save the world from evil aliens, use your wizardry against an evil dragon, or fight a dungeon full of zombies with a shotgun a certain number of times before it becomes tedious. This drives some designers to avoid any story, setting, or theme that has been done before, sometimes pushing their story and setting into something so offbeat that players are unable to understand what it is or relate to it at all. For all their potential to be abused, cliches have the tremendous advantage of being familiar to the player, and what is familiar is understandable and comprehensible. It has been said that every successful video game finds a way to combine something familiar with something novel. Some designers would never make a game about ninjas because ninjas have been done to death. But what if you made a story about a lonely ninja, an incompetent ninja, a ninja dog, a robotic ninja, or a third-grade girl who leads a secret life as a ninja? All of these storylines have the potential to be something new and different while having a hook into a world that player already understands. It is certainly an error to overuse cliches, but it is an equal error to exile them from your toolbox. Story tip number 10. Sometimes a map brings a story to life. When we think of writing stories, we generally think of words, characters, and plot lines. But stories can come from unexpected places. Robert Louis Stevenson had no intention of writing what is considered his greatest work, Treasure Island. Obligated to entertain a schoolboy during a particularly rainy vacation, he and the boy took turns drawing pictures. On a whim, Stevenson drew a map of a fanciful island which suddenly took on a life of its own. As I paused upon my map of Treasure Island, the future character of the book began to appear there visibly among imaginary woods, and the brown faces and bright weapons peeped out upon me from unexpected quarters as I passed to and fro, fighting and hunting treasure, on these few square inches of a flat projection. The next thing I knew, I had some papers before me and was writing out a list of chapters. Most video games do not happen in world of words, but in a physical place. By making sketches and drawings of the place, often a story will naturally take shape, as you are compelled to consider who lives there, what they do, and why. Story tip number 11. Surprise and emotion. Writing stories is hard. Getting them to emerge from games is even harder. But generally, when stories are dull, it is because they lack surprise or emotion, or yikes, both. If you find that your game story is dull, take out your old friends, lens number 1 emotion and lens number 4 surprise, and point them at your story. You yourself might be surprised and emotional at how much they help. So much more can be said about story that we cannot possibly cover it all here. But whatever you create, whether it be an abstract game with only the thinnest veneer of theme and setting, or a vast epic adventure with hundreds of detailed characters, you are wise to make the story elements of your game as meaningful and powerful as possible. So, we end this chapter with a general purpose lens, which can benefit any game as a tool for studying this very important quadrant of the elemental tetrad. Number 78, the lens of story. Ask yourself these questions. Does my game really need a story, and why? Why will players be interested in the story? How does the story support the other parts of the tetrad, aesthetics, technology, and gameplay? And can it do a better job? How do the other parts of the tetrad support the story? And can they do a better job? And how can my story be better? Some other reading to consider is Character Development and Storytelling for Games by Lee Sheldon. Lee has written for dozens of games and just as many television shows. He condenses his lifetime of storytelling experience into this very practical book. Interactive Storytelling for Video Games by Josiah Leibowitz and Chris Clutt. More excellent advice on interactive storytelling from two experienced professionals. Story by Robert McKee. Considered by many the Bible of Hollywood screenwriting, this book is clear, accessible, and full of excellent advice. The Writer's Journey, Mythic Structure for Writers by Christopher Vogler. This book has a reputation for being too formulaic, but it makes many powerful ideas easy to understand, and it has given powerful insights to many great screenwriters. Digital Storytelling, A Creator's Guide to Interactive Entertainment. This book is chock full of examples and tips, not to mention thoughtful interviews with interactive storytellers from all over the industry. And finally, Writing Fiction, A Guide to Narrative Craft by Janet Burroway. Now in its 10th edition, this book is for anyone serious about becoming a great storyteller and writer, and won me over from the first page, Chapter 1, Whatever Works.